Welcome to Django and Tailwind CSS. Now in this course, I'm going to show you how to integrate a Tailwind project with Django, leveraging Django's built-in features for managing static files. That means serving the static files in development and then referencing them in production on a static file server, like an S3 bucket or something like that. Now the reason we use Tailwind in our projects is because it rethinks how we actually style all of our HTML components. So for example, your headers, right? By default, when you just use an H1 tag, it has some standardized styles to them. Tailwind removes all of those styles. You can add defaults, but the thing is, you want to be really explicit when using Tailwind. You want to give it the exact properties or the exact classes that you want to assign to that specific header. And this is true for all HTML elements. It's really fascinating. The other thing is how Tailwind works with color is really nice as well. So there's support out of the box from the CSS class itself to have a standard mode, a hover mode, and a dark mode. So that means that you can have different colors for each one of those states of any given element, and it just works. It's really cool. And that's one of the reasons that I really like Tailwind CSS is like how well thought out each component is. Now, this is a little bit different than a front-end framework like Bootstrap. Bootstrap has an opinion about how things should look. Sure, you could customize them, but when you use an element in Bootstrap, you actually just provide some sort of class, and then there's a lot of things that are inferred from that class. Tailwind doesn't work that way. If you want a rounded corner, you have to use the rounded class. If you want a certain kind of background, you have to use the background class. If you want a certain kind of hover color for your text and your background, you have to denote those things. So the Tailwind classes start to get pretty big, which is okay. And like I said, there's a way to shortcut that, and there's a lot of stuff that you can do with Tailwind that we're really just going to be scratching the surface here. My goal with this course is to show you how to integrate it with Django so then you can start building on top of it from there. Have a really solid foundation with that, and then we'll talk about some of the really cool features with Tailwind as we go forward as well. So if you have any questions, let me know. My name is Justin. I'm going to be taking you through this one step by step. Now, it is probably a good idea to have some familiarity with CSS and maybe with Django, but really this is just fundamental for both things. So I will maybe go a little fast for some of you that aren't that familiar with those tools, but overall it's meant to be a really comprehensive look at how to set these tools up together so they work well now and in the future. And if you integrate something like Vue or React, it should still work with those things as well. Let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so the requirements for this series, I'm going to breeze through them first, and then we'll go back and go through each one in depth. First off is Python 3.8 or above. Next is the latest Node.js LTS. Then we're going to need a text editor. I recommend Visual Studio Code. Then we're going to be using Django 4.1, and I'll talk about 4.2 in a moment. We'll be using Tailwind CSS, and in this case, I'm using version 3. 2.4 is not as necessary, but definitely version 3. I think a lot of the things we'll do here are going to stick for quite some time. And of course, if you need any specific section reference or lesson reference, check out the course on my website. And if you need any help with installation of certain items, just go into the guides here and it'll show you how to install Python on Mac or Windows. And then the actual code itself is going to all be available on GitHub at this repo right here. There will be different branches that represent the different sections of this course or the different lessons of this course. Now, for a little bit more of an in-depth look here, you definitely want to download the latest version of Python. I recommend downloading 3.11. You might as well start using the latest version. If 3.12 or 3.13 is out, by all means, try those. Just check them against the version of Django that's out and whether or not it's actually supported for the latest version of that. More than likely, 4.2 will be supported long after the version we're using here. Next, you might be wondering, why are we even using Node.js at all? Now, what Node.js will do is it actually allows us to run our Tailwind commands. So with Tailwind, it actually by default doesn't have much CSS in it. You can add a bunch of stuff to it as you see fit. The Tailwind application, the Node.js application, will watch HTML pages or JavaScript pages for changes that will occur or most likely will occur while you're developing. It's really, really cool. We'll see this in action soon, but that's why you need the JavaScript. The JavaScript part will watch for Tailwind changes, but then it will also build the actual output CSS file that we need to use. CSS doesn't have a default way to do this, so we need Node.js to be able to install the Tailwind tooling for that. Visual Studio Code has a bunch of plugins. I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but I do recommend this one. You can use any one that you like out there. Next, the version of Django. Of course, on djangoproject.com/download, I referenced the 4.1. That's what we'll use in this course because 4.2 isn't officially out yet. I know that the static file configuration is going to change slightly from 4.1 to 4.2. So that's just something to be aware of. Those changes I intend to put on the GitHub repo for this project when it makes sense to. At the time of this recording, it doesn't make sense to. Now, if you're still using Django 3.2, by all means, use it. You can use it for a long time going forward. And just because there's no longer support for that version doesn't mean that you can't learn from that version still. Because so much of Django that happened 10 years ago, literally, still exists in Django today. Yes, there are changes in a lot of configuration and support for certain things, but they're mostly minor because the Django project is so good. Certainly, they become major when you're putting them into production or you're trying to do something that just isn't possible on an older version. So it definitely can get to be a major pain, but the actual things that have changed in the last 10 years isn't crazy. Anyways, so the code itself, like I said, I'll have a bunch of the code in here as different branches, so you'll be able to review it, check it out, both in terms of Git, but also on github.com. You can actually see the different changes and all that as well from lesson to lesson. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and actually get this project started. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and create our main project folder and a virtual environment. Now I'm going to do this using my terminal, but you can use VS Code. And of course, if you're on Windows, you'll use PowerShell. So in this case, I'll go ahead and navigate into where I want it to be. I'll go ahead and do make dir, mkdir -p, ~dev/Django Tailwind CSS. Now, what this -p does is it'll make sure that dev as a folder exists as well as this folder. This is true about subfolders as well. And then I'll cd into here, just navigating in, and I'll list things out, and I'll do pwd or dir if you're on Windows. You'll actually be able to see exactly where you are, what location you're in, just to make sure that you're working off of this. Now, for those of you who do this with me all the time, I apologize for the repetitiveness, but setting up a virtual environment is so necessary that we have to do it pretty much the same time every time, and we would need to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So hopefully you have Python 3.11 installed. Let's do -- version and just verify. In my case, I do, and this is the latest version of 3.11. I also have other versions of Python 3 installed as well. So I have Python 3.10. I've got Python 3.9, right? You can absolutely have all these versions installed as well. At the very least, use 3.8 and above, like I've already mentioned. But I'm going to go ahead and stick with Python 3.11, and we'll just see if this ends up working. I know for a fact that some Django packages do not work with 3.11 yet, but that's now when I'm recording this. It's also possible that they were updated. Now, Django itself works with 3.11, but some third-party packages do not. I think there's one related to Celery that doesn't, so you might have to use 3.10 for the time being. But switching virtual environments is actually really easy to do because of what we're going to set up. So we're going to go ahead and create our virtual environment with Python 3.11 -m, the virtual environment package. So this will be the command. And then venv, of course, is the virtual environment name. If you're not aware of that already, that's just one of those fundamental things that's built into Python. Now, of course, you can use other virtual environment managers. There's something called Poetry. There's something called pipenv. To me, venv has been the most reliable among all of them in the various versions of Python. And it's the easiest to communicate with students. So that's the other part that makes a big difference for me. But yes, there's ways to improve how you work with virtual environments. That's not something that's in the context of this particular project. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and make that. Now, of course, if you were on Windows and you went through my installation process, you would have been doing something like this, and then python.exe, and then -m venv, right? So hopefully you already know that if you're on Windows. But for the rest of us that are not on Windows, we should have our virtual environment in here. If you are on Windows, you will have the virtual environment as well. And then we'll do source venv bin/activate and hit enter. And of course, that activates our virtual environment for us on the terminal. Now, if you're on Windows, it's just simply venv scripts/activate. Also very simple. You just change bin to scripts, and then you change the path slashes, and you don't use source. That's it. Really simple. But now, from here on out, most of the commands should be the same. Now, one of the things I do want to have is I want this in VS Code. So to do that, I just do code.period, and that will open this project up, or this folder up, in VS Code. Now, if you don't have the VS Code command line tool open, it's not that big of a deal. Just open up VS Code and then into a new window. In the File Explorer opening, you go to Open Folder, and then you navigate to the folder you're trying to use. Really simple, not that complicated. Hopefully you all know that. Anyway, so let's go ahead and save this project here, just like that. And then I'll go ahead and leave the requirements for the next one. But at this point, I have a virtual environment in here. But VS Code isn't activating it by default. This is something that it has inconsistent behavior in my experience with VS Code. In other words, my virtual environment is not activating by default. Okay, so that's how you can activate it. You just need to be aware of the command you need to run in order for that to happen. Now, if you're not aware, you can also just use a direct path to the version of Python that you're using in that virtual environment as well. And of course, if you're on Windows, it's most likely, I believe it's scripts/python.exe --version, something like that. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So now that we've got this, let's go ahead and actually get the requirements going and install Django. All right, so now before we jump in, let's go ahead and do a little housekeeping here, and that is this git ignore and readme. Now, if you're not aware, this is just files that are for GitHub and Git. So if you go on the GitHub repo now, you actually can see some of the details and some of the code related to this project. That's where those files came from. They came out of nowhere, seemingly. And then also at the very bottom here, there's going to be something that says /end. That is related to this video itself. So that's what the state of the code is going to look like at the end of this one. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and actually install Django and then set up our Django project. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called src. This is typical as to where you would store your Django project, in a folder called src. This is actually typical for a lot of code, not just Django, of course. So in here, we're going to go ahead and create a file called requirements.txt. I'm also going to go ahead and create just simply notes. I'll do pip-notes.md, and I'm going to paste in 3 commands to install pip. Okay, so each one of these are just simple ways to use requirements.txt with pip. And then you also might consider checking out a package called pip tools. This is outside the context of this one, but it's a really cool way to manage your requirements inside of virtual environments or in all sorts of places. But the general idea is we need to actually create our requirements and then install them. These are the 3 recommended methods if you are going to use requirements.txt. So, of course, we need to actually do Django, and we want it to be less than 4.2. So go ahead and save that, and I'll run the installation like this. So with this open, if I open up my terminal here, actually if I open up a fresh terminal here, it actually activates the virtual environment. And that's because it says pip requirements down at the bottom there, which is great. So it's actually, VS Code is intelligent enough to know that, hey, these are Python requirements. So I'm going to go ahead and activate the local virtual environment that starts with VE and V. I think there's other names that it also supports, but that's the default one. Anyway, so with this in mind, I can go ahead and now do my installation here. Now, this command is running in the root of the entire project here, right? So if I look here, it opens up into the root of the entire project folder, not necessarily in the SRC folder, which is why these commands even exist. So realistically, inside of SRC here, it would probably be better to just have it like that. But having these different methods is important to know about because you don't want to use the wrong version of Python. You don't want to use the system version of Python or the system version of pip. Using the virtual environment version of Python is ideal for the reason that it's the correct version of Python, hopefully, and then also the version of Python's pip, like it's built into it. That's another reason for that. Nevertheless, we now have Django installed according to this right here. And so I'm going to go ahead and create our Django project now. So let's go ahead to SRC here, and I'll go ahead and do Django-admin start project. And I call my projects CFE home. Every single time I call them that, that's where my main Django configuration will end up being. Now, every once in a while with some of my older projects, I call it a different name. So if you are reviewing code on my GitHub repo, sometimes it is the actual project's name. I've been going back to just using CFE home because it makes sure that all of the projects themselves, the configuration for them, are in CFE home. Now, since this entire series is about configuration, that's actually kind of important. So basically, wherever settings.py is, that's the main Django configuration file, or folder rather, as you might be aware of. And then we also have urls.py in there, as well as wsgi.py and asgi.py as well. So those configuration items, that makes this the configuration folder and where we're going to be using this a lot, right? So at this point, we have Django installed. We have a lot of things set up. Now we need to actually get the process going of handling our Tailwind CSS folders. So actually setting the stage for our static files and all that. Now, the reason I'm not going to be building out a full Django project is because this is about integrating the two, right? This is really just about how do we set the bare bones to be able to use Tailwind in Django. Let's keep going. Now we're going to go ahead and create a folder for our output static files from Tailwind. Now, this is also for any other sort of static files that we might need. Let's say, for instance, if you're going to be using Vue.js and you need to build some of the final JavaScript files, those would also go in this same location. Now, generally speaking, this is just good for development environment. If you go into production, just check out Django storages. And then when you run collect static, it will actually go into S3 buckets, which is something we're just not going to do in this one because we're not going into production. But if you want to see how that process works, let me know in the comments and we'll take a look at it. But it's really, really simple on how we're going to do this. So inside of SRC here, I'll go ahead and create a file called static. And then inside of the main project folder here, we're going to go ahead and say local-cdn. And then inside of there, we'll go ahead and create static as well. With that local CDN, I'll actually add this into my git ignore here because I'm just emulating what a actual production CDN would look like or a production S3 service would look like. Either one, but the idea being that this is just emulating what production would end up being. So with this in mind, I now have two destinations for my static files. The first thing that we need to do is go into settings.py. We're going to navigate down to the static URL. Of course, all of this is referenced really well inside of the Django documentation, but let's go ahead and get it done. So first off is the static files _ dirs. This is a list of all of the places you want to store static files. In our case, we have one place. It's this right here. So what you could do is you could copy the relative path, and that's going to be an src static. This is the relative path to the root of the project itself, to the Django-Tailwind folder. This, of course, is not great. Now, another thing you might do is actually copying the full path. Also not great, because if I send this to you, that's not going to work anymore, right? So what we do instead is we use the base dir, right? So this base dir, this is using pathlib. What it actually ends up resolving to is this same exact thing can be treated like this. those are actually the exact same paths, except when I send it to you, it's going to still work. It's still going to go to the same path as well. So if you're not aware of that, that's just the idea behind pathlib. It's fantastic. It's a really, really good tool. The next thing is we're going to do static and root. This is going into where we want to store these things for production. Not local development, but actual production. So this is actually going to be very similar to this, but instead of the base directory where Django is, we want to go one level up, which would mean baster.parent. So this is actually how I can get this path right here. And then I can just use slashes for all of the other paths, which in this case, it's local-cdn. Pathlib is fantastic. I really, really like it. But of course, there are other ways on how to do this. One of them is using OSPath, which I don't have right in here right now, but ospath.join. You will see this from time to time as well. And I believe pathlib and OSPath can coexist at this point with the Python history, but if it doesn't, you can just put that into an SRC or str, rather a string, and then it will give you the same exact root. This is the old way of doing it. Pathlib is the new way of doing it. Okay, so that's only part of the configuration we need for local development. The other part is going to be actually serving these static files. So we only want to do this in debug mode. We only want to do this in development. I'll say that time and time again. But the idea here is we do from Django.conf, we're going to import settings. So this settings we want to look for is if settings.debug. So basically, if it's in debug mode, then we can do what we're about to do. So do not do this in prod, basically. We'll do from Django.conf.urls.static. We're going to import static. Now you're like, how do I possibly remember this? Well, you don't. You go into settings.py. If you go here and you open this up, you scroll down a bit, what you're going to find is this right here. That's what I'm doing. Literally that. So I'm more or less copying and pasting. So instead of URLs again, the reason I just put this in debug is because that's the only time I want to use it. And then I'll go ahead and use the static URL, which was the default one right here. This is the URL it's going to serve these static files on from the static files DIRs folder, or more specifically from the static root folder, which is what this is doing, this document root here. So we just do URL patterns plus equals to all of that. Now I realize that I've probably already told you this stuff before, but it's still important to implement them and make it work. If I haven't told you these things before, this might have gone a little bit faster than you might expect. And so check out Try Django, any of my Try Django series, because I go into a little bit more detail here, although I don't know if there's much more detail to be had other than just to test it out. So if we do python manage.py, collect static, hit enter, I see that 130 static files were copied to local CDN static. This, of course, has to do with, if we go into local CDN, static, and admin. That's the Django admin is coming in here. Inside of SRC, I have a blank static folder in here. So if I went in and did, let's just do my own, I'll just say custom and, input.css, or rather, let's call this custom.css as well. And then just did like H1 and color being red. This is just for illustration purposes. I won't actually use this. I collect the static again. It's going to ask me if I want to overwrite these things. This is okay at this point. And what it does is it overrides the admin, but it also brings in custom.css. So as you might imagine, this is essentially what we need to do with Tailwind. We need to have some sort of input CSS file and then also some sort of output CSS file all go inside of Django. And then that will then eventually be collected to either the local CDN or the production one. And so that's what we'll still need to do. But before we get there, there's another thing that we need to configure. So let's go ahead and take a look at template files with Django now. Now we're going to go ahead and configure a Hello World homepage for our Django project, which means we need to configure our templates and create a couple templates. Now to do this, we are going to jump into settings.py, and we're going to do something very similar to what we did with static files. and that is go into the templates here and just do base dir / templates. Okay. Inside of SRC, we'll go ahead and create templates, and then we'll create base.html. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste something. So you can easily recreate this, or you could go into the GitHub repo and find the branch for 6-end, and you'll be able to copy and paste it directly from there. But the general idea is, of course, I need a base template, a base HTML template, so I can, inherit from that. And so in here, I'll go ahead and create something called pages, and then I'll go ahead and create home.html. And this, of course, is going to extend from base.html. And then we want to replace this block content in here with whatever we want to say. So something like hello world. Okay, very good. And so with that in mind, let's go into CFE home again and just create views.py. And they'll do from Django.shortcuts. We're going to import render. And then we'll go ahead and define home view or home page view. And it's going to take in a request, and it's going to return render, the request itself, and then the template, which is pages/home.html. And then we'll use empty context at this point. So with that in mind, in my URLs back in here, we'll go ahead and do from import views, and then I'll go ahead and wrap in an empty path for my homepage view. So views.home view. And we can also give it a name if we wanted to. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and run the server and just have a look. Python manage.py, run server. And I do have migrations that I would need to do. But for now, I'll just leave it at hello world, just like that. Okay, great. So we've laid the foundation to modify this quite a bit with Tailwind. So of course, we need to actually create that Tailwind application now before we can actually make any real big changes here. So one of the things with base.html, I do have this load static here, which is something that I may or may not do in the long run. Or what I also might do sometimes is have something like this, where I have my CSS in an external file, right? So I want them potentially in both, where it'd be something like link real equals to style sheet, and then href is going to be some sort of static file here. So if I did static, and I do have a static file in here of custom. So let's do custom and CSS, or rather custom/custom.css. And then we close that off. And then in base, I can actually include it, right? So we include, and there's going to be head css.html. Save that. And if I refresh in here, I now see that those static files are actually loading. So at this point, I should have all of this working correctly, just like this. Now, the reason I have html.css as its own template, and I also do, js.html as well, is really just so I can see at a glance really quickly what static files or what CSS files I'm loading in without having to open up base.html and do a bunch of scrolling, which you potentially could have. It also keeps base.html really, really clean and concise. And with this include tab, I can use conditional rendering of some of these things as well. So if I have a dashboard that uses a lot of the same sort of CSS, but not all of the same, I can still use the same CSS file with some conditional rendering in there as well with how Django templates work. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into that detail with the templates. If you want to know about that, let me know in the comments. But for now, let's go ahead and actually start getting our Tailwind application going. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and start our Tailwind side of this project, which means that I actually am going to use npm, the node package manager, to install Tailwind locally to this project. So npm actually does a really good job of managing development packages or local packages, right? Python, we have to use a virtual environment manager. npm sort of has one out of the gates, and that's node modules, as we'll see in a moment. So we'll go ahead and do npm install -D and then Tailwind CSS, and we'll hit enter. And this will create this node modules here. Notice that mine is already grayed out. So if you are using Git, make sure you do not commit these node modules because they are huge. Look at just by default, I already have a bunch of things that are in here just with one package. So that is something we don't want to pass around. We also have package.json and package.json lock, which have to do with the Tailwind version, the thing that I just installed. So something you'll often see with npm packages is this filled out a lot more than what we've got here. The nice thing about doing it the way I did is it's just really concise to what we need to do in this package, but it's kind of missing some things that we might want in the long run. One of those things would be a scripts declaration, right? So it's very often that you'll have a script in here, and I'll just say echo something like, we'll do hello world like that. And then I can run npm run dev, and that just echoes out hello world, right? So we can actually run all sorts of commands. So this npm is a really nice way, npm run especially, is a really nice way to just run one-off scripts. Now me personally, since I have a Mac, I use a make file all the time to run off these scripts, but we'll actually build out this script to run with Tailwind, which is the point. So with Tailwind installed, I can actually use another tool called npm or npx. So npx is a way to execute one of these packages. So if I did just npx Tailwind, now that it's installed, I can actually see all of the things that you might want to do with Tailwind. So here's the usage right here. This is absolutely what I'm going to want to use up here. So we've got Tailwind, we've got an input. So let's get rid of these brackets here. We've got an input, we've got an output, and then we have the ability to watch it. And there's other options as well, but those are the main ones. Okay. So we can also shorten input to just -i. We can shorten output to just -o, which is incredibly common, but also very obvious right here. Watch is great for development environments. It's going to watch for changes, which we'll talk about in a second. But the idea here is we want to have this command running. But we actually haven't even started our Tailwind project yet, so what we've got here is Tailwind init. I'm just going to do a very, very simple one of Tailwind init, Tailwind CSS init. But of course, I can't just call Tailwind CSS because it's not on my command line anywhere. So I have to run npx Tailwind CSS, and that will actually just create this Tailwind config file. Now, that's this right here. I could write this manually, right? I don't actually have to use Tailwind init to do this. But there are some other options for Tailwind init that are available to you, which is something I'm not going to cover right now. But the idea being that we now have our configuration and we have a package. The last part of this that we really want to do is really setting up our input and output. Okay, so the input itself is going to allow us to declare which Tailwind features we want and some of the shortcutting of things that you might do in the future. I'm not going to go into all of the configuration for Tailwind because there's a lot to it. Instead, I just want to show you some of the fundamentals. So inside of static here, we're going to create another folder, and I'm going to call this TW, as in Tailwind. I actually usually have this in as SRC, but to keep things really simple and clear, I'll keep it in as TW. And then in here, I'll go ahead and call this tailwind-input.css. So that is the file that I want, and I'll actually use a relative path this time. So I'll go ahead and paste this in here, and now I've got this relative path that goes into SRC here, into static, into TW, and then Tailwind. And then the output is the one that I actually want to reference on my Django project. So in this case, I'll go ahead and do static, and I'll go ahead and just say my output being in a CSS folder. And this one, I'll go ahead and copy that relative path, and we'll leave it again as just simply output, right? So I'll go ahead and, or we could call it CFE home UI or something like that too. Okay, cool. So now that we've got this, let's go ahead and give it a shot. I'll run npm run dev. Okay. So I actually don't have an input at all, right? Remember, I didn't actually put anything in this input, but the Tailwind command did it for me. Fantastic. CSS, I also don't have any output because, well, Tailwind doesn't know what to look for in terms of output. That's something we'll still configure. But I can add one thing to this, and that is to the Tailwind input. And that's some of the base components in here. So the base components are definitely available, and it's very obvious inside of the installation process. Of course, we've already done a bunch of these things in here, but you would grab this right here and you would just paste that in. You save it. Notice that when I saved it, it automatically changed everything, and including my CFE home CSS, right? So it gave me a bunch of boilerplate stuff related to Tailwind and clearing out all of the previous styles and all that, which is fantastic. That's exactly what I wanted in terms of actually having Tailwind. So you could absolutely customize the CSS as you see fit, but what we really want to do is not customize things just yet. Instead, use some of the built-in features that Tailwind has. So we need to implement how to actually create a home page and how to monitor for changes inside of our Django project as well, so that our final CFE home UI actually does look correct. So let's go ahead and do that in the next one. All right, so now let's talk about the magic of Tailwind and how great it is by really just changing some minor things for this home.html. First off, I'm going to create a div in here and I'm going to put it around my H1. I'll go ahead and add in some padding and I'll do P of 10. So P-10, this will give me padding all around the inside of this element, as you'll see shortly. I also want to do text red and we'll say 500. What I'll also do is hover text white and then hover BG, let's do black. Okay, so now I've got all of these classes I want to use from Tailwind. Now, in order for Tailwind to know about this template, I have to go into Tailwind config inside of content here, and I need to add in /source/star/star.html. Now, a little bit more flexible here would be doing the curly brackets, HTML, and JavaScript. What this line right here does is it's going to look inside of this SRC folder in any folder path. That's what these two do, is any folder path. So literally any file in here with any file name, it's going to look for HTML and CSS in there. So you can make this very explicit or just sort of general like this, where it just matches a lot of files. It's basically looking in this SRC folder for any HTML or JavaScript file, and it's going to go ahead and update our CFE Home UI CSS related to those things. So since I created this and saved it, my actual command for npm run dev already rebuilt it. When I say it already rebuilt it, that means that in CFE home-ui.css, if I scroll to the very bottom, I actually see these things in here. Everything that I just declared, I've got my P10, there's my padding of 10, which is actually 2.5 reams. And then I've got text red of 500. What do you know? Hover and all this stuff. Fantastic. This is why I really, really like using Tailwind for this exact reason. So now that I've got that and I want to take a look at my homepage, the last thing, of course, is to make sure that I'm using CFE Home UI CSS. So in where I'm loading in the CSS on my Django project, I need to bring this one in, and that's just simply CSS and then CFE home-ui.css. So we save that. I don't think I need to change anything, but when I do save it, it does rebuild it. And so if I refresh in here now, check that out. I mean, I have it where now if I hover over that div, it changes colors. Yeah, the pointer doesn't change because of a lot of reasons, but it's definitely changing colors. So you can actually go into the Tailwind documentation for text color, and you can see all of the different text colors for red. Fantastic. How about backgrounds? Well, do a quick search for background. And I'm not seeing the backgrounds that I want, so I'll do background color. What do you know? I go into background color. Here's all of the background colors you can use. So let's say, for instance, we want the hover color to be BG gray 400, like I saw there. I've got this hover block here. So hover colon is how you can actually declare this is the state, or this is the class you should use on the hover element, and you have to do one at a time. And so we come in here and we change it to BG gray. This will rebuild. And then I come back into my project, I refresh, and now when I hover over it, there you go. And if you need to change the cursor, right? So if we did the cursor, we could do a quick search for cursor, and here's all of the different cursors that we can use, right? So it even shows you an example right there. So cursor pointer, what do you know? You want it to be a pointer. You want it to look like it's clickable. Save that and come back in here, refresh, and now it looks clickable. It's certainly not clickable, but it definitely looks like it, right? In the terms, it's not clickable because I don't have any JavaScript on there, or it's not a button or an anchor tag. And so now we actually have Tailwind fully integrated. It's definitely fully ready. So we could obviously build out a little bit more, and we will, to just get a better sense as to what's going on. So of course, the tricky part of Tailwind is actually building out all of the components you might need going forward for your entire project, right? So I do recommend that you maybe go a little bit deeper into learning about all of the things with Tailwind prior to fully committing to this. But even if you use it with another framework, you can get away with it by these things right here. Now, if you're using Bootstrap, Bootstrap does have support for certain padding, so maybe that will have an issue for you. So if you wanted to just default to the Tailwind padding, you would just put Tailwind below the Bootstrap one. So if you put Bootstrap up here, you'd put the Tailwind right below that, the output file, and then boom, you're off to the races. So what I actually want to do to kind of finish this one out is to finish off this landing page and have it actually look like a proper like, hello world, welcome to this project. This course is all about integrating Django with Tailwind. It's not necessarily meant for you to go in depth with Django or in depth with Tailwind. However, this one I hope convinces you that you should spend more time using Tailwind. And it has to do with some of the built-in features that Tailwind has. Okay, so one of the things I want to do is I want to center this hello world. Now, one of the ways I could do this is by coming in here. First off, I'll do H screen. So this is going to make this div the size of the screen itself, at least for the height. So height is going to be that size. Next, we're going to go ahead and do justify and center. Okay, so if I do those and we refresh on this home page, nothing seems to change. So if I bring it in with flex, save it, and then a refresh again, now we've got it in the center. So just this element is justified right in the center. Now, if I wanted in the absolute center, I can go ahead and do items-center, save that, refresh, and now it's in the absolute center. Okay, so not a whole lot to get an absolute center item. Now, for those of you who are familiar with CSS and this issue, it is not a trivial issue for some reason. It keeps on being a challenge to make this single thing happen. Now, that's of course not it. That's not all I want to do here. What I want to do also is say something like text white, and then we'll just do BG and blue and 800. So we save that, we refresh in here. Cool. So now I've got a sweet background with a nice color. But the thing is, I want it to be a gradient. I actually want it to sort of like go from a lighter blue to a darker blue. And that's also pretty easy. I'm actually going to move this blue to the front of this class here, just so it makes it a little easier. And to create this as a gradient, we can just do bg-gradient-2-r. So it's going to be from left to right. And then we can start from BG, or the blue color. And then we can go to blue, let's say 900 or 800, whatever. I'm going to bring this number down, so it's going to go from light to dark. So we save that and we refresh, and what do you know? That might be a little too light, so let's change it to like 400. We save that, and there we go. So we've got a nice gradient going on here. This to me is like so cool. And of course, if I did the gradient to the bottom or to B, I get this gradient. If I do it to the top, it reverses it. If I do it to the left, it goes the other direction. Left as in L, right? Really nice. Now I can also add another gradient element in here. So in the middle, I can also do via blue and let's say 300. So now it's going to kind of come in and out. And there we go. Let's change these numbers a little bit more so it's not as light there. And there we go. So now we've got this other kind of gradient. Pretty cool. And if I do it to the bottom, again, it will sort of give me that same sort of element here. Now, what if I want a little bit more robust of colors here, and I want this to be a little bit bigger? So first off, to make that bigger, it's as simple as doing class text-XL, right? Or I could do 2XL, or I could do 4XL, right? And then I can also make it bold with font bold. Save that, and there we go. Great. Now, let's go ahead and go back to this color and use different colors. So if we do a quick search for colors, we've got all kinds of colors that we can use in here. So I'm actually going to scroll on the sidebar here and navigate into customization of colors. And so what we see is all of these colors in here. Maybe you scroll down and you're like, oh, I really like sky blue. Instead of just the regular blue, I want this blue here. And so you come in here and you do sky, sky, and sky. You save that. You, let's say, refresh in here. And maybe it's rendering here, but maybe it's not. So if yours didn't render, what you need to do is come into Tailwind config. You bring in the const of colors, and you put this equal to require. And this is going to be Tailwind CSS / colors. And in our theme, what we can do is we can bring in colors here. And I can say sky is equal to colors.sky. So I can refresh in there. Or if I wanted to change sky to like violet for some reason, oh, let's put a comma there so it's correct. I can change it to violet. So just like that, I just changed that default sky color. I want to leave it in as sky. And maybe I want to have violet in here still, right? So colors.violet. Save that. And so then I could come back into my home page here, and let's change this to violet 400. And now we've got a different kind of look here. And maybe we wanted to go to black instead of that color. And let's go ahead and go into the colors and make sure that we can even use black in here. Looks like I don't have black as an option. So I'll just use stone for black. So I'll do black equals to colors.stone. And then in that case, I'll do black 900, or rather, let's just call it stone 900. So back in here, bring it in. We've got more colors. We refresh, and there we go. So I'm not sure if these colors look that great in general. You'd probably want to use different kinds of gradients. But the point is how easily it is to customize all of these things. So that is something I really like about these colors. Like colors alone is like one of the reasons to use Tailwind, right? You've got all of these built-in colors that you can use, just like we saw. And then you can also add in your own colors, right? So I didn't show you black, but if I actually brought in black in here and did the hex color for black, right? So we did 0 all across the board. Let's change it to now to go to black. We save that, refresh, and there it is. Now it is the black that I just set. And then if I want the CFE color, right? So that is absolutely something you might end up doing. Not necessarily the CFE color, but your own color. And you do to CFE. And now it's actually going down to that color. I mean, like how fast that happens is phenomenal. Now I realize I'm flipping back and forth and going like maybe too fast for a lot of you. But the idea here is we can really customize this. And this is just a fraction of what we can customize inside of Tailwind. But one of the things you'll probably do first is trying to get all of your colors done correctly. And what's cool is whenever you see something like from sky 600, you can put your own color in there and have your own color numbers, right? So in here, we can also have our own, let's say, for instance, my CFE blue or something like that. I can now come in here and do 100 being some variant of 007 CAED or something like that. I'm not sure if that's a good variant or not, but we could come in here and then via CFE blue 100 and refresh, and there we go. So it actually does show me that actual color that I just added in here. Now, again, this is not necessarily something you would end up doing, and perhaps you would call it, something a little bit more specific to your project. But all of this customization is well documented on Tailwind, which is why, I keep jumping back to the documentation itself. But that's it. That's like the main part of what I wanted to show you as far as integrating this. And then, of course, like whenever you need to change something, let's say, for instance, this text white is not working for some reason. well, we can bring it right down on here. But of course, part of the problem is the fact that the colors that I have here are fairly limited. So if I did white and colors.white, then I should bring that white should actually come back. And sure enough, it did. And same with this one, colors and dot black also should come back. And that's just a matter of experimenting with the colors that come in here. You could also just set colors. You don't necessarily have to customize anything, and that will give you availability to use all of these colors, except for the CFE ones, all the custom ones that I just did. So yeah, it depends on what you are trying to do as far as the customizing of those colors. Now, this is all to say that just because you have these here doesn't mean they're going to be outputted. They're still going to be outputted when you use them. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to remove some of the old ones, like if you are still using some of them. I think it does, but sometimes I've seen the caching issues where it doesn't. But as we see in here, I don't see violate anywhere. So it's actually is removing ones that I'm not actually using any longer. And so this text white, I probably don't need it twice. I come back, and what do you know? It's all back. Very good. So I really, really like Tailwind. If you want to see more, let me know. In the next one, I'll just chat about a few other resources that you might want to check out to get Tailwind into your Django project even more fully. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. And more specifically, hopefully now you're really interested in learning more about Tailwind. There's a lot to learn, so I don't think it's a trivial thing to jump into, and it's certainly outside the scope of one single course to learn all of Tailwind. In fact, I don't recommend that you try to learn all of it. Instead, I recommend you learn bits and pieces as you need them for your projects, just like what we did here. All I really wanted was to have some sort of landing page like this with Tailwind working, and this is a good enough start, what we did. Now, one of the things that you will want to have most likely is stylized forms. So if you go to the Tailwind documentation for plugins and you scroll down a bit to one of the plugins called Tailwind Forms, this is a plugin that you can easily use in your Tailwind projects. And this is how you set it up. And then you would actually change a lot of your input values, the classes, to fit with Tailwind. And there's also crispy forms, CSS, Django, and Tailwind. That's usually how I search it. But we've got a crispy Tailwind package as well that I found to be pretty good when it comes to using Tailwind within Django crispy forms. It's not perfect. Like there's still a lot of things that need to happen for it. And as it says, it's still in early stages of development, which is a big part of the reason I actually didn't cover it. Now, Django itself, you can add in classes directly into forms. And then all you would need to do is you would need to update your configuration to check for those forms. So I would add in a whole item in here for forms themselves that are just, let's say, .py and forms. Right? I would do something like that to actually look for the classes that might be in forms.py. The bigger that this is, the more files that are in there, the longer it's going to take to compile the file. Hopefully that makes sense. A big part of the reason, of course, is the fact that, well, there's a lot of files in there. So you would probably want to be even more explicit about where things are located, even within the templates and all that, and maybe specific forms that you wanted to review as well. Otherwise, it does start to take a long time, and you're like, "Hey, why aren't the styles showing up?" But both of those things are good. The plugins, as well as doing direct CSS, as well as the Django Crispy Forms for Crispy Tailwind. I've actually had some success with this. It's just early days in the terms of development for that. I think it's mostly because of how Tailwind actually generates the CSS for any given element. So that's definitely one thing. Now, the other thing, if you're coming from Bootstrap, like I did, Flowbyte is fantastic. There's a lot of really good things about it. There's a lot of really good free stuff about it too, that you can use right now that just gives you some of these components, right? There's even some Django setup stuff that I think is fairly useful to build on top of what we've did here. And you should be able to just jump right into that as well. But then there's like some dark mode support that's really super easy to use within Tailwind. but then mostly these components. This is like why it really got to me, all right? So you look at a button, they give you all of these different buttons with a bunch of Tailwind-based classes. It's just a bunch of examples for these things, right? And there's a lot more than just buttons, of course, as you can see right here, including modals and all that. So Flowbyte has some JavaScript and some of its own customizing things that you might want to look at. But that's pretty much it for the next steps in terms of Tailwind. Figure out how to use it with forms, and then if you want to replace Bootstrap, you go into using something like Flowbyte. I'm sure there's other things like Flowbyte out there. I've just found this one and I found that it is incredible. And they've got a great tooling for supporting, developers and all that. Now, Tailwind CSS also has some of its own components for user interface and all that. These things aren't free, and perhaps these are what you'll want to use as well. So going to the advanced stuff, you might be like, oh, I'm not ready to pay for something like this. The reason you would pay for something like this is it dramatically increases the speed as to which you can get this done, but also gives you some best practices sort of built into these components when it comes to using Tailwind itself. So thanks again for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you want to see more things with Tailwind, definitely stay tuned because I'm going to be covering it in more comprehensive projects, and I'll probably reference this series when it comes to integrating Django and Tailwind in the future. So thanks again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.